Hello, it's good to see you. Today we are going to be just reading some random sections from a book about textile mill history of a particular mill down in the South around the Carolinas. And we're just going to just read some stuff at random here. In 1893, the United States was feeling the effects of a worldwide depression that began in England in 1890 after a large banking house failed. British investors unloaded their American securities, which, in turn, caused a drain of gold from the United States. American banks began to tighten credit, and soon every area of the American economy felt the financial strain. Massive unemployment in Great Britain and the United States severely reduced the demand for Southern cotton. Cotton prices plummeted to 5 cents a pound. By late August of 1893, Captain Sam White found that he couldn't meet the company payroll. He told the workers that he didn't have the money to run a full shift, but he would try if they would be willing to accept half of their usual wages and the balance in cloth. Some workers agreed to the offer, but a large number met on their own and voted to turn down Captain White's offer. With less than 1/3 of the workers agreeing to White's terms, the mill ran less than 1/3 of its looms. Soon, the mill shut down completely for some months. Nationally, the panic of 1893 left 3 million industrial workers unemployed, perhaps 25% of the working force. It was 4 long years before the nation and Fort Mill returned to full employment. The United States Census of 1900 shows that a majority of the 469 workers at Fort Mill Manufacturing Company in Milford were between the ages of 15 and 25. Few were older than 35 years. 113 were under the age of 15. 2 were 7 years old. 6 were 8 years old. Apparently, the mill owners and the supervisors found the young workers more pliable. They could be trained and directed more easily. The young were not so likely to resent receiving orders from 18-year-old overseers. The fine threads that so easily knotted or tangled called for young, nimble fingers. In a few families, there was a tradition of cotton spinning. Glenn Walker, who was born in 1903 and worked in Fort Mill, recalled that his grandmother owned an old wooden spinning wheel with a foot pedal and an old loom. A little one about 3 foot, you throw the shuttle through, pull the yarn, pull the reed. His grandmother lived with them. She spun her yarn from cotton she grew and then dyed it with the bark of walnut. All of her yarn was either one shade of brown or left natural white. The grandmother had 2 hand cards made of wood with steel needles. She would card the cotton smooth and then work it with her fingers onto the spinning wheel. She used cotton only. She had no sheep. She knitted socks for Grandpa and made suits by hand. From her cloth, she made her children's clothes and wove many pillowcases and towels. Her quilts were handmade from cloth she had woven. Glenn's grandfather had begun working in the old Rock Island woolen factory in McAdenville, North Carolina, when he was 8 years old. Glenn's father worked in Highland Park Mill in Rock Hill before he came to work in Fort Mill's Luna plant. Ruth Ogburn's grandmother, McCarter, had a spinning wheel, cards, and a lot of sheep. She made wool blankets and quilts. As a young child, Ruth carded the batting for the quilts. Many other young mill workers like Ruth and Glenn were already familiar with the process of spinning and weaving before they began work in a cotton mill. They learned to work at an early age and did not feel that there was anything wrong with child labor. This picture here is the spinning room employees of Fort Mill number 1. The man standing at the top of the stairs is carrying a time clock. And there are you can see children in here, barefoot children. And down here, this is the White plant, Fort Mill number 2, which ran second-hand looms, originally installed in 1848 in the Graniteville Mills. This ran until 1917 when the picture was taken. The old looms were melted down for the World War I effort and replaced by new automatic sheeting looms. The 1900 census reveals that typically the parents did not work in the mill. Typically, the head of household was a father between the ages of 35 and 50 whose occupation was listed as farmer or day laborer. The mother was most likely to be listed as housewife. In the same household would be 3 or 4 sons and daughters who were listed as spinners, weavers, doffers, spoolers, quillers, or holders of similar mill jobs. Older women and children tended to be the spinners. Young boys were sweepers and doffers. Early writers describing cotton mill village life frequently write that there were a disturbing number of fathers who had no visible work other than to show up at the mill on payday to collect the earnings of their children. The Fort Mill census does not show any non-working fathers. It is said that Captain White would not tolerate that kind of behavior, but does have fathers listed as day laborers and children working in one of the mills. The census also shows that some of the fathers of young workers were themselves on the payroll. When Samuel Franklin Massey recorded Fort Mill's Mill Village census in 1900, he made note of the family of John M. Lee. Lee was 42 and employed as a cotton cloth baler. Sarah A. Lee, 37, with 12 living children, was listed as a housewife. At home, there were 7 children who were designated as working in the mill and 5 younger children listed as at home. Daughter Minnie P., 18, was a spooler. Her sister Rosalie, 17, a spinner. The census taker marked that they could neither read nor write. Next were Robert F. and Walter M., twins, aged 16, both weavers, who could read but not write. John L. and David A., 14 and 12 years, were doffers. Neither could read or write. Nancy B., age 10, a spinner, was marked as able to read but not write. Reuben F., 8, and another set of twins, Claude and Mason E., were attending school. Samuel J., 2, and Elijah G., 4 months, completed the 14-member John M. Lee household. While this household was an exception in having a father over the age of 40 work alongside his children, it was not so unusual to have 12 children or more in a household. Young children of some of the supervisors also worked in the mill. William Parks, 51, was head of the cloth room at one plant. Unfortunately, the census taker failed to record the plants at which the workers were employed. He had 4 children between the ages of 11 and 23 who worked under his supervision. Even the superintendent of one of the mills, Robert Butler, a native of Pennsylvania, had 4 children who worked in the mill. His 21-year-old son, William, was head spinner. 2 sons, aged 18 and 13, and a 16-year-old daughter also worked in the mill. In a few months, an adept child of 10 might doff, spin, or weave practically as well as an adult. By 1900, mill machinery technology had reached such a high state of development that highly skilled workers were not necessary to operate the machinery. The days of a 5 to 7 year apprenticeship were gone. More of the operative's time was spent machine watching. There was time to socialize. Perhaps the informality stemmed from the old work habits of field labor where people talked, laughed, and sang while the task at hand was carried out. Many old-timers remembered that there was no guard at the gate and that young children roamed and played at will. And this is a picture of the inside of the Fort Mill Plant No. 1 around 1919. Workers in this picture include Beulah Baker, Pauline Elms, Daisy Bass, and McCampbell Stamper. It doesn't say who's who. In the early days, it was not uncommon for older brothers or sisters to bring a nursing infant to its mother to be fed and then taken back home until it squalled for another feeding a few hours later. If the mother was a spinner, the work was so light that if the mother lived nearby, she went home to feed the baby. A number of mothers could be seen leaving the mill for that purpose at 9 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. Mill work increased the relative earning power of the girls in the family. Among the older generation, especially the fathers, There must have been a real concern about the new order that made the young more valuable in an economic sense than their elders. A 12-year-old girl in the weave room could expect to earn more money in a year's time than her tenant farmer father. Ordinary farm labor wages were only about one-third of the wages of mill hands. A girl spinner earned as much as a boy spinner. However, there were no female section hands or overseers. Most South Carolina cotton mills had a higher percentage of women and girls than men and boys, but this was not true in Fort Mill or in Chester. The 1900 census showed 309 males and 160 females in the two Fort Mill plants. The wages paid in southern cotton mills were generally less than one-half those paid in northern cotton mills. The major advantage that southern mills had over the northern was in the area of cheap wages, not, as often claimed, being closer to the cotton fields. New England states had laws forbidding child labor and night labor for women and children long before South Carolina passed such laws. Following several years of intense debate, in 1902, the South Carolina legislature passed a bill prohibiting the employment of children in factories who were younger than 10 years. Still, one way or another, children under the age of 10 were on the payroll. Especially useful was a loophole in the law which permitted children to work if no one else in the household was working at a public job. And this is the white plant, Fort Mill number 2. These are the operatives dressed up. Note women with hats in the first row. Oh, I see their hats are in their laps. Okay. And this is the white plant in Fort Mill after expansion. At the left can be seen Culp's cotton gin with bales of cotton on the yard. Oh, right there. The road in the foreground led to Rock Hill, where York County's largest number of cotton mills were concentrated. The photograph was taken from atop the town water tank by W.B. Meacham, Jr. about 1930. In Fort Mill, there was never a mill school as in Lancaster and Chester. The children of the mill village attended the town school. Fort Mill got its first public school the same year that Fort Mill Manufacturing Company was organized. In 1891, Samuel E. White was the president of Fort Mill Graded Schools as well as president of Fort Mill Manufacturing Company. White shared a dilemma with other conscientious mill presidents of his time: the problem of balancing a child's needs for an education against the hard economic fact of income for a struggling family. Gradually, improving economic conditions and the realities of the consequences of an unschooled populace would tilt forward toward schooling. South Carolina had one of the highest rates of illiteracy in the country. The fact was that working children, whether on farms or in mills, were not in school. This is the white plant turbine generator room in the 1920s. The man at right is Lee Skipper, general manager of the plants in Fort Mill. Mill owners of the better sort began to find little advantage in child labor. In 1905, about the time some of Leroy Springs' supporters were taking up a campaign for governor for him, the colonel went on record as favoring a compulsory school attendance law. He felt that education was the best combatant of poverty and that illiterate parents had no justification in handicapping their children by forcing them to stay on the same level as the parents. The state and its political factions were about evenly divided between those that held that it was a father's right — legally the mother had few rights — to make decisions about his children without state interference, and those who supported a state's right to use social controls through legislation for the public good. Leroy Springs favored the latter, a position from which he never wavered. And when August Kahn made his study of child labor in South Carolina's cotton mills, he reported that at Lancaster cotton mills, a study was made to determine how many children of employees were not attending school because they lacked money for shoes and books. Superintendent C.B. Skipper went door to door. When he found parents who did not have the money, he told them to go to the company store and get the needed items for their children. The mill would pay for the children's education. Springs also angered the followers of Cole L. Bliss, a racist politician, by proposing public financing of literacy programs for blacks as well as whites. The South Carolina cotton manufacturers met in Greenville, June 5, 1906. This group represented 9/10 of the mill owners in the state. Out of the meeting came a proposal to the South Carolina legislature requesting a compulsory education law, a marriage license law, and a law requiring registration of births. The long overdue bill, Osborne Amendment, finally passed in 1911. The same legislation prohibited employment of children under the age of 12 years, exclusive of farm labor, and prohibited night work for those under 16 years. Children's ages were checked by use of the parents' affidavits. Still, there was a loophole. Poverty cases were exempt from the law. The surrounding farms had many children who qualified as poverty cases. Glenn Walker went to work as an apprentice doffer in Fort Mill at the age of 10 in 1913. His father told the superintendent that Glenn was 14. He received no wages for the first 6 months, and then he made a penny an hour, 11 cents a day, 60 cents a week, and they paid every 2 weeks on the 15th and 30th. When his father was sick, the boy's pay supported 7 people. The fare was simple. Glenn said, I sat down at the table with 2 pieces of fatback or fatback grease with a little sugar and sopped that in a biscuit with a cup of coffee and then went to the mill. I came home at 12 o'clock dinner to have a bowl of cabbage and cornbread and was lucky to have that. Mama made bread almost every day. Ate the same thing that night if there was anything left. Finally, me and Grady, his brother, got up to $4.75 a week, and we thought we was rich. 3 cans of salmon for a quarter. Some youngsters worked part-time at the mill and attended school too. That was the case with Levi Deese in Lancaster. When he was 10 or 11, he went to school in the morning at the Central Grammar School, getting out at 2 in the afternoon. After going home and changing his clothes, Levi went to the mill where he swept and picked up bobbins until 6 in the evening. This led to permanent work in the spinning room. A number of families remained on the farm, with one or more of the family walking several miles to the mill job. Ella Garris, who started work at the age of 10, lived 2 miles from the Lancaster cotton mills. Before reporting to her workstation in the mill at 6 o'clock in the morning, she crossed several cotton patches, 2 cow pastures, and a hog pasture to get to the unpaved road that led to the mill. After a few months, Ella boarded in the mill village with her aunt. And this is a photograph of Heath, Springs and Company of Lancaster, circa 1888, and reveals that the staff of mercantile stores of that era was likely to be all male. This group contains at least 4 men who were to become business leaders of their day: Osgood P. Heath, William Chappell Heath, John T. Stevens, and Leroy Springs. The last 3 were cash boys or runners, who in the days before cash registers had the task of carrying the sales slips and money from the clerk to the cashier and bringing back the customer's change. If the farms were located too far from the mill and there was no room with relatives in town, there were boarding houses, particularly for the young men. By 1900, Fort Mill had 10 such establishments, with perhaps a quarter of all the workers boarding at one place or another. Leonard Young's boarding house had 10 boarders listed in the 1900 census. A family named Robinson rented a 4-room mill house across the street from the White Plant's front door for $1 a week. They took in 3 young men and charged them $2.50 each for room and board. At noon, the mill would shut down for 1 hour so that the workers could go home or to their boarding houses to eat. Later, the time for lunch was reduced to 20 minutes, causing more people to carry their lunches with them. Robert Bailey's family had 7 boarders. Sam and Rebecca Merritt, in their 60s, had in their household their sister, Nancy Thorne, 66, along with the Merritt's daughter, Emma, and her husband, Calvin Crapps, a weaver. The living quarters must have been very cramped with the Crapps' 1-year-old son, Noland, and another Merritt grandchild, 9-year-old Julie May Bass, besides 3 boarders, Thomas McGuire, 63, who served as the mill watchman, smash hand James M. White, 24, and Joseph Jones, 21, a weaver. The 1900 census also showed a combination hotel and boarding house run by Joseph Harris, a black man who headed Fort Mill Manufacturing Company's dye room. There was a great deal of moving. Between the farm and the village there was much intermigration. Larger families living on the farm could not employ all of their youth. Surplus children went to the mill. When work was slack at the mill, many workers returned to their farm families. Dan Pettis recalls that in the fall, his foreman would let him off for a couple of weeks to go home and pick cotton. Much has been written about the notion that the first generation of mill workers thought that they would someday return to the farm, and some did go back, but most did not. The mill villages became homogeneous circles inside of circles. Mill workers were aware of the larger world outside the mill, but they were economically bound to the mill whistle. Slowly but surely, the old agricultural rhythms were subordinated to the quickened pace of mill life. Fort Mill Manufacturing Company, like other mills across the Piedmont, ran a company store, in this case called the Mercantile Department. The building was of wood construction with high steps and was located directly across the street from the front door of the mill. Almost anything a family needed, groceries, notions, shoes, and cloth on the bolt, was available. The company store carried the workers from one payday to the next. The first manager of Fort Mill Manufacturing Company's Mercantile Department was J.B. Mills Sr., who left after a few years to go into business for himself. In 1904, the mercantile store was sold to L.A. Harris, an uptown Fort Mill merchant who operated it successfully for many years. Here's a picture. A sizable crew of workmen under the direction of Linwood Dobson stand ready to clear the ground for the first big addition to the Lancaster cotton mills, April 20th, 1901. The mules probably came from the extensive cotton plantations of Leroy Springs. That's a big building in the background. When Lancaster Cotton Mills Plant No. 2 and the office were completed in 1901, the plant was called the $1 Million Mill. This photograph of William Green Williams and Elliott White Springs, originally printed in the Springs Bulletin, shows a section of the Lancaster train depot in the background. The wooden depot, 400 feet long, burned in 1913. It served as a cotton warehouse for the mill. Let's see. What did I get to? By 1903, the 2 Fort Mill cotton mills had villages with a total of more than 150 4- or 5-room tenant houses. Town housing had also increased in the 15 years since D.A. Tompkins' plan had changed the destiny of the town. Before the 2 cotton mills were built, the village of Fort Mill had 38 houses. By 1903, the town, excluding the 2 mills, had 113 houses. The town and mill villages combined had a total population of 1,600. These figures supported the dreams of the original cotton mill subscribers. Indeed, mill building had turned out to be town building. And we are going to stop there. This book gives 100 years of history of textile mills. This is just a little section of it. I'd like to read some more, maybe in a whisper later on if you're interested. Just stay tuned for that later. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little bit of reading here, and I'll see you again really soon.